All right, welcome everyone to the Keweenaw Time Traveler Researcher Relaunch. My name is Don Lafreniere and I'm the project director here at the Keweenaw Time Traveler. And we welcome everyone who has joined us today to learn more and celebrate with us about the Keweenaw Time Traveler and our deep mapping project. So we actually have 3 relaunch events and we want to make sure that everyone knows what we're doing at each one. So this one is a virtual relaunch event for researchers. So this is the event that you're at here today. Tomorrow, for those who are in the Keweenaw region, we're having a relaunch celebration at the Carnegie Museum of the Keweenaw. If you're interested in participating in that, there's a registration on our website. And we also have doing a virtual relaunch celebration on Facebook Live at 3 p.m. on Friday for those in the community who aren't able to attend the relaunch celebration at the Carnegie Museum. So here's the schedule of the webinar today. I'm going to start off with an introduction and history of the project, and then I'm going to turn it over to other members of the Keweenaw Time Traveler team to talk about how we built it. And so we'll have Gary, Dan, Sarah, Tim, and Ryan all come up and talk about different components of the project and how we got to this point. Sarah will then do a live demo and show you how our online deep map actually works. Sarah and I will then come back. We'll talk about applications and accomplishments of the project to date. We'll also then transition to talk about what's next for the Keweenaw Time Traveler project, and then we'll take questions from all of you. So the Q&A function is how we're going to sort of communicate during this webinar. So you'll see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of the team. We're going to be monitoring the Q&A throughout the webinar, and we'll respond either in written responses via the Q&A tool or verbally, but we're going to keep all the responses to the end of the presentation. Okay, so you're here and you somehow found that we're having this event and want to know what is the Keweenaw Time Traveler. Well, the Keweenaw Time Traveler is an online deep map that enables interpretations of past lives and environments in Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula by connecting the public with researchers and inviting them to recreate the past in time and space. So we use the concept of deep mapping. And deep mapping aims to create a fine, detailed, and multimedia depiction of space and place through time. It aims to provide a spatial way to represent the complex world that humanists study with its myriad of connections between people, places, and environments. To date, the Keweenaw Time Traveler has linked people and places and environments together through space and time from the 1880s through to present. So, where is the Keweenaw? Well, the Keweenaw is located on the shores of Lake Superior in extreme northern Michigan. We're also referred to as Michigan's copper country because we're the oldest and one of the largest copper mining regions in the United States. We use the Keweenaw as our case study for this online deep map because of the rich documentary and material records that are of national significance in the region, especially to study industrial development, labor, social, and immigration history. So there are a lot of challenges that go into creating a deep map. First, when you create a deep map, it requires you first to be faced with the universe of data available to you, right? Which is, we have so much data about the world, contemporary and historical. From there, you need to create a prime deep map, which is largely driven by the interests of the research group creating the deep map. And so for us, that was the period of industrialization and deindustrialization of our region from 1880 to 1960, and then extending it into the present. Once you create your prime deep map, you then create personal deep maps, which are created when individual users ask questions of the spatial temporal data within the prime deep map. And then from there, at the top, spatial narratives can be formed. So if you think about the relationship between a deep map and a spatial narrative through the metaphor of a hop-on, hop-off bus. So like that tourist bus, a spatial narrative takes you to a pre-selected location and evidence. while a deep map experience begins when you step off the bus and begin exploring the data more deeply. So our approach to deep mapping, is through what we refer to, well, it has sort of two components, okay, that work together. One is the Copper Country Historical Spatial Data Infrastructure. This is our prime deep map. And this is a research infrastructure for studying a whole bunch of different types of scholarly pursuits. To date, we've done things like migration, social mobility, heritage management, environmental change. But then the other half is the Keweenaw Time Traveler itself. And this is the online interactive deep map that creates many opportunities to engage the public in deep mapping in different ways. So it's through the exploration of maps and data through time, and we're going to show you during our demo how to do exactly that. The ability to search for people, addresses, places, and stories, and then for individuals to contribute their own place-based stories, their own memories, their own images. This is really the creation of spatial narratives and providing a platform that allows people to create their own spatial narratives with data and information about the past. And then building relationships through in-person and online programming, similar to what we're doing here today. When we put these two components together, the research infrastructure and the Keweenaw Time Traveler as the online deep map platform, this is our approach to deep mapping, which we refer to as public participatory deep mapping. We've done that, and I'll say that it's not just to do this and to do public participatory deep mapping well, you can't just put the deep map on the web. You need to go out and engage with communities and show them what is possible and what is available to them via this online deep map. And so for the number of years since the launch of the initial Time Traveler, we've been going to festivals, doing public meetings, and going to where the community groups are that are interested in using the online deep map. We also had an earlier phase in the project where we created three what we call citizen historian apps, where we asked users to document how what buildings were made out of, to classify how buildings were used, and to transcribe information off of maps. And we found that having public users engage in building their deep map has shown to have a major impact on how it gets used and has promoted the long-term sustainability of the project. In addition to it being built by our public users, this project is inherently interdisciplinary. We've had 45 faculty and students work on the project since 2016. You'll get to meet several of these folks here today as part of the project team, but you'll see that we come from a number of disciplines across the social sciences, humanities, computer science, the geosciences, and library information sciences. The project is housed in our intellectual home, which is the Historical Environment Spatial Analytics Lab here at Michigan Technological University, as well as the sort of actual physical laboratory and technical expertise comes from the Geospatial Research Facility. The project also has a number of partners, including the Michigan Tech Archives and Library, Monty Consulting, the Carnegie Museum of the Keweenaw, the Keweenaw National Historical Park Advisory Commission, and IPMS USA, among others. So the project has had a number of phases. The first phase of the project started in 2014 through internal grants from Michigan Technological University, where we went out and scanned and georeferenced a number of historical maps, and my colleague Gary is going to come and talk with you about some of that. In 2016, we received our first major funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as the Keweenaw National Historical Park Advisory Commission, to create historical environments and recreations of historical environments in GIS, to build the Copper Country Historical Spatial Data Infrastructure and the Keweenaw Time Traveler, to build those citizen historian apps that I just mentioned, and to do some of the public programming to engage people with the project. From that point, we had two concurrent grants in phase 3 one that was focused on creating and mapping and linking school records and hospital disease reports. My colleague Tim will be talking about that in a moment. And another one from the Council on Library and Information Resources that is mapping and linking employee records from mining companies. And my colleague Sarah will be talking about that. And that then brings us to our current phase. And our current phase is graciously funded from the Office of Digital Humanities at the NEH, as well as another grant from the Keweenaw National Historical Park Advisory Commission, where we are creating the space-time links that you're going to see in our demo to actually produce the deep map itself. It's also, we use a public collaborative design process, charrette process, for redesigning the user interface that you're going to see. We're expanding our public programming and educational resources, and my colleague James will be talking about that. And also to develop tools to support the replicability of the Keweenaw Time Traveler into other communities. And my colleagues Dan and Ryan are going to be talking about that. So, to date, the Keweenaw Time Traveler has produced within its deep map special temporal link data of over 600,000 records, representing almost 20 million variables coming from a number of sources that you can see here on your screen. And they're all record linked through time. You're going to hear about how all that works. So I'm going to turn it over to some other members of the team now, and we're going to kind of walk through how we built the Keweenaw Time Traveler, how we built the CCH SDI, and some details about how you can use it yourself. So I'm going to turn it over to Gary.
Thank you, Don, and hello, everyone who's joining us on Zoom. I'm going to talk to you about some of our original data sets that are, hang on, slide, thank you. Some of the original data sets that were integral to the first version of the Time Traveler and will continue to be integral to the new version of the Time Traveler. Don mentioned that there were various project phases, and the first phase was focused on georeferencing historical maps, well, digitizing and georeferencing historical maps. So working with our heritage partners, we scanned over 1,100 historical maps that date from around 1865 up through 1950. Now, if you're familiar with the original version of the Time Traveler, that may seem like a lot of different maps that weren't there, which is true. Our original version of the Time Traveler only supported our Sanborn fire insurance plans and a historic topographic map that we used as a base map beyond just the satellite imagery that you'd be familiar with if you're using something like Google Maps. So our new version of the Time Traveler will support all of those other historical maps that we haven't been able to integrate yet, which I'm really excited about. But for our sort of core data set, our sort of spatial bedrock of the Keweenaw Time Traveler is our set of Sanborn fire insurance plans. Now, once we got those digitized and georeferenced, we then had to go through and digitize the built environment variables that these maps hold. So this was over the course of basically most of 2016. And it wouldn't have been possible without dedicated work from undergraduate researchers, graduate research associates, and a team of high school interns who we were able to hire from the local communities, teach some GIS skills, and do some sort of some heritage work with them. So with all of those efforts, we were able to digitize all of the built environment structures that are on these fire insurance plans. So what we mean by digitize is tracing all of the building footprints at the level of each individual room. So we have very specific geography for each of these structures, and we recorded their address and height and some other important information about them. So our final data set of this is about 116,000 structures across our 7 major population centers of the Keweenaw. Then we had to map people. So the first place we went to look for the people of the Keweenaw was the city directories for Houghton County. They're not a perfect data set, but they were readily available in the Michigan Tech archives, and they spanned a length of time from about 1888 to 1939. We ran all of those city directories through optical character recognition using Abby Fine Reader, and then had to clean up the results from that optical character recognition. So cleaning the data is something you're going to hear a lot about in the various different stages of the time traveler. So in order to clean that data, we used regular expressions through a scripting language called Groovy. And this allowed us, so we identified some really common errors from this example here. If you look at the top, you have a comment that sort of describes, we noticed that addresses ended up being read as sequences of letters rather than sequences of numbers. So an address that is 100 on some street was actually Lou on some street. So we had to correct that. But because we were able to identify so many common errors, it was relatively easy to get that cleaned up. We then had to go through and parse all of this information out into usable formats. So things like names, their tenure. So we were able to identify whether people were boarding at a place, whether they owned the place or they were just renting, what their occupation was, whether they were widowed, and then of course the address itself. And we were able to identify that based on patterns and how the directories displayed the data. So when all was said and done, we had this group of 86,000 people that we had parsed out of the directories, and we were able to map 74,000 of them based on all of those addresses we had collected from the Sanborn fire insurance plans. And to sort of lead into the next data set, Dan Treppel is going to talk about the US Census.
Thanks, Gary. As Gary mentioned, the built environment landscape that we reconstructed in the Keweenaw Time Traveler really came from those Sanborn fire insurance plans. And we started by digitizing and geocoding those city directories, but the real sort of social backbone, the historical social landscape of the Keweenaw Time Traveler is kind of underpinned by the US decennial census. And geocoding that census was sort of my pandemic project and has sort of trailed on since then with new improvements and iterative advances in what we're doing here. And so what we did for that particular data set is not start from scratch as we did so much with the city directories, but actually use IPMS USA's fantastic digital census data set that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. This is sort of the gold standard of digital census, historical-based census research. In our case, we're actually using the censuses for Houghton and Keweenaw counties, which is essentially sort of our project area in census terms, covering 6 censuses, so 1880 and then 1900 through 1940. And that's a total of almost 380,000 individual person records. So that's what we started with, was the digital IPMS data. We still did an awful lot of manual cleaning work on it to sort of reformat it for our own purposes. And dealing with a data set this size, of course, is littered with challenges. And it's a big data set, a big historical data set. We had, each census varies in terms of time. Every one of them is formatted slightly differently. The original enumeration forms contain transcription interpretations and inaccuracies or gaps. And standardizing those outputs is also a lot of work. And of course, really those gaps in the data are the biggest challenge, because this is a huge, impressive data set. But when you drill down into it, there's many, many little gaps and sort of inconsistencies you have to deal with, characteristic of historical data. So doing this geocoding required an approach that differs a little bit from what has traditionally been done. Geocoding the census is, of course, not new. And there are categories in the census data like state and county indications that make it really easy to geocode on a certain scale. What we did is actually develop a 4-level hierarchical scale for geocoding. And the idea here was to improve the precision of our data set, but also facilitate different levels of inaccuracies or gaps in the data. So the way this essentially works is we go first to our Sanborn fire insurance plans, which provide us with a very detailed landscape of the built environment. Of course, their coverage is incomplete, but the scale is so fine and it presents us with such a tantalizing opportunity for mapping people that we can't ignore it. And we devoted a lot of time to geocoding as many people to the building that they actually lived in as was possible. using those fire insurance plans as our base. For people that couldn't be geocoded at that level of precision, we developed a couple of intermediate bins. The first of which is the street centroid, so the center of the street they lived on. We reconstructed these using a modified version of the Michigan GIS open data road layer that was modified appropriately for the historical time period. Fortunately, our roadmap here hasn't changed drastically over the last century or so. When we couldn't get someone onto their street, but we still had some locational information, we actually developed a third bin, which is a little bit more synthetic, and that's the settlement. And that is essentially a place that is meaningful to contemporary local community members, but is something that may not be an incorporated place. It may not be an official town. It might be a mining location that was well known by people at the time, but not necessarily something that persists today in a visible form. And it captures sort of those more ethereal or vernacular places. And we did a lot of historical research and spatial reconstruction to establish locations for those places. And then our final sort of catch-all is enumeration districts. Every census record was enumerated in a particular district which has boundaries. Reconstructing those boundaries was a lot of work because the maps, when available, and they're not always available, can be somewhat vague or casual in the way that they're drawn, and at a scale that makes it harder to get down to those more precise boundaries. So we did quite a bit of research reconstructing either the verbal or map boundaries to a more precise level, and then geocoding everybody that hadn't made it into the first three bins into that final bin. The benefit there is that it allows us to get 100% of the people in that nearly 380,000 individual person record sample geocoded into the Keweenaw time traveler and into the HSDI. And of course, while this is the largest single social environment data set that we've created, in addition to Gary talking about the city directories, Tim and Sarah are going to discuss a couple other data sets that also fill out our social environment and add some different data to the Keweenaw time traveler. So I'll leave it to Tim.
Thank you, Dan. As Dan said, my name is Tim Stone, and I've been working on the school records project for some time now. As you've heard, we put a massive amount of effort into including the census and city directory in our time traveler, in our HSDI. And those provide a fantastic amount of information about social categories and demographics that are largely focused on working adults and heads of household. But one thing that we have access to that is very unique is a set of school records that provide a lot of detail about children who lived in the area. So this is again, very unique and it provides a picture into what life was like for children in an industrial city, which again is pretty special. So like a lot of the other record sets in the HSDI, we had to start by scanning these. They came in large ledger books that spanned from 1904 to 1926. They contained semester by semester records from every local school, which you can see pictured on the right. And then we started geocoding them. This is one of the times when it was really, really valuable to have all of this housed within HSDI, because we were able to reference other records that are already existing in the HSDI to facilitate the geocoding process. So for example, if a student had a sort of ambiguous address, such as 105 Pewabic Street, and we didn't know if that was north or south, then oftentimes the city directory already had a parent mapped to either that north or south address. And so that both improved the speed and the precision of the geocoding process. That was then followed by record linkage, which you'll hear more about from Dan, but the record linkage process really facilitates some cool research, which I will talk about in just a second. So here's a little snippet of one of the records. On the left, on the far left, you can see the name of each student. Class sizes varied drastically, with classes as big as 43 or 44 kids, but were often in the 20 to 25 range. So each student's name was recorded along with their age and date of birth. For those of you that have done record linkage, those are three very important categories that are fairly unique and will, again, facilitate very quick record linkage and with a high precision. Then you get into some school specific variables, such as how often they were absent and present at school, down to the half day, and then the number of times they're tardy each semester. That is followed by their grades, and then one very interesting variable, which is a binary vaccination category, which is just a general yes or no. And finally, we have their residence recorded, which again, we supplemented with information from the census and the city directory to put them in the correct house. And in this case, we focused on the residential house as our main scale. So as I said previously, this has facilitated some really awesome projects. We've been able to look at the effects of the built and social environments on students' health, which is still ongoing. And then we have also created rich data-driven descriptions of students' lives. And one of the awesome parts about all the record linkage that we've done is that we can tell these really in-depth descriptions about any one of the students that we have data for, as opposed to a more traditional history where you only focus on a couple of students. And finally, when the pandemic hit, we sort of transitioned what we were doing to focus on disease outbreaks using local hospital reports to investigate how the schools acted as vectors in that disease transmission. And we can do much, much more. One of the awesome things, again, about having all of this within an HSDI is that every new data set that we incorporate, such as the employee records, which Sarah is about to talk about, will give us more detail that we can ask more questions about and just continue to study these records in new ways. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Scarlett. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm going to tell you about one more big data set that we are working on. As Tim mentioned, this is a set of employee records, and we've been creating this with help from a grant from the Council on Library and Information Resources from their Digitizing Hidden Collections granting program. And so we're working with a set of about 40,000 employee cards that were kept by the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company, which was the largest and ultimately kind of the most powerful mining company here at the height of industrialization. And so through this project, we've been able to hire undergraduate students who have been scanning and transcribing and creating metadata related to these employee records. And then the geospatial research facility staff are working on doing the record linking and the mapping to connect this data set to everything else you've been hearing about in the Keweenaw Time Traveler. For this project, we partnered with our colleagues at the Michigan Tech Archives and Copper Country Historical Collections, which is part of our university library, so that at the end of this project, the scanned images of the cards will also be searchable by name, and you'll be able to see those images through a research portal at the Michigan Tech Archives. And I should say that this data set is not yet available in the Keweenaw Time Traveler. COVID sort of altered our timeline for this one a little bit, but we do aim to have these ready by early in 2023, and we'll be sure to tell you all about that when they're available, but they're coming. But I want to specify a little bit about the information that's in these employee cards. So this is the main way that Calumet and Hecla kept track of all the people who worked for them. And so it has the sort of standard information that allows us to link with the other record sets. Names, where they were born, their parents, their children, often where they lived, very important for us. Then it also keeps track of all of the jobs that they had, often over decades of working for CNH. So kinds of jobs they had, how much they were paid, why they left, when they came back. And also as the records reach into the 1930s and 40s, we get information about workers' compensation and some health information. So it's another great example of why this particular region with these amazing records from mining companies makes the Keweenaw a really rich place to create a deep map like this one. So I'm going to turn this over to Dan again, who's going to tell us more about how we're connecting all of these data sets.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so you've heard Don and Gary and myself and Sarah and Tim all allude to the record linking. And just to sort of wrap that up a little bit, moving on to my next slide here, a major goal of this project is to attempt to link as many person records, individuals, within the HSDI and the Keweenaw Time Traveler as possible across time and space. So every instance of their appearance in a record, we're attempting to link to that person's other records to essentially create a unique individual ID for a person and then connect all of their records from different record sets into that. This is a major overarching goal of the project, and all that geocoding work that we did previously was sort of bent towards eventually supporting this kind of work. And this is the most active phase of the project from my perspective right now, and many of us are working on this. So some of you may be familiar with IPM's multi-generational longitudinal panel, the MLP, which was record linking the census across years. This is an amazing project that was sort of released while we were beginning our work. And so we've been following that rather keenly, and we've incorporated some of their work here. And they managed to link people together in the census because the census contains so much information. In the case of the data sets we're working with, other than the census, so the school records, the employee records that we're working on now in the city directories, these are relatively data poor in terms of the kinds of information that each one of them contains. You might only have a name and an address or something like that, rather than in the census where you have a name, address, and age, and immigration year, familial relations, and so forth. So our process differs a little bit from IPM's process, but we're doing essentially the same thing here, where we're cleaning up the data manually, which is quite a bit of work again. And we're using a probabilistic record linkage software, in our case, Linkage Wiz, to link two data sets together and find match individuals between those two records based on as many different fields or categories of information that we can gather from these historical record sets. Then we manually review the results and we format them and put them into our HSDI and the Keweenaw Time Traveler system. And that's available as part of the website. So the reason that we do this is that it really makes this bigger than the sum of its parts. The benefits really include, we're mitigating some of these gaps in the historical records. So these gaps in data poor records or records that are very incomplete or may have a lot in some records and less in others. When we combine several record sets together, we're able to actually create a richer picture of a particular individual. And that's especially true in the case of traditionally underrepresented groups in the historical record. The more records we can gather about people, the more likely they are to have a fleshed out picture across space and time rather than just in one instance. And then finally, over time, this will improve our ability to geocode people more accurately. If we know more about where they lived at different times, we can compare that with incoming records and get a better picture of where that person lived in that particular given record. And these are the kinds of things that you'll be able to see when we do our demo here in a moment. So just about now, I'm going to turn this over to Don and Sarah, and we're going to do a little demo to kind of illustrate some of the things we've been talking about up to this point.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So yeah, we're at the time we're all very excited about, which is also the most challenging when you're doing a live event, is to try to do a live demo. So we're going to make a transition here on your screen, and Sarah's going to walk us through a demo of the live Keweenaw Time Traveler deep map.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. So yeah, we're going to do a demo here to try to get a sense of what this deep mapping experience is like. So you start off here on our sort of landing page, is beautifully designed by our partners at Monty Consulting. First thing I'm going to do is just hit the Explore the Map button here, just so you get this image and you'll get a sense of the distribution of the data across the Keweenaw region, and you can use the categories or the data category tabs up here to see either all the data or the distribution of just the records related to people, or the places records, or the stories, which are the user contributed stories, okay? But to dive in, I'm actually going to start off by searching for a particular person. We're going to search for Angelina Arco. And it zooms right in to a number of her records. Gathers data. Okay. So we're actually going to start with the sort of latest or most recent of her records, see what she was doing in 1930, and then we'll work backwards, kind of digging down through time to learn a bit more about her life. So here it zooms right into her house. You can see she's selected here, and if I hit full details, then over on the left in the full details bar, you'll see what we know from the 1930 census. So here's her address, 4247 11th Street in Calumet. She was 23 that year, right? She had been born in Michigan, though her parents came from Yugoslavia. Okay, and as a young woman, she was a stenographer for one of the mining companies. You can see over here the people she was living with. Let's zoom in a little onto her house. There we go. And so here she is with her family, living with many of her siblings, her mother, right? And zooming in, we can actually turn off the markers if you want to look at the map a little bit in more detail. You can see more about the house they were occupying. This is a pretty standard house in this region, wood frame building, 2-story house, okay? And so now what we'll do is sort of dig down through history and see where she was living 10 years earlier for the 1920 census. And you notice that it says approximate. Okay, so this is an example of one of those times that Dan was talking about when we were not able to map her specifically to a house, but we were able to map her to the street. So this is 9th Street. And at the corner of Chestnut. So these are all the people, 23 people who are living, along houses along that street, right? And this is also one of the places you can see where the Sanborn Fire Insurance Company did not map. So if we zoom out a little bit, we can see, right, they were mapping Calumet here and Laurium, but they didn't make it out here to Tamarack, which was a location, a little town set up by the Tamarack Mining Company, which was eventually bought by the Calumet and Hecla Company. But so while we don't have Sanborn maps, we can see some historical maps. If we shift over here and choose instead the C&H property map from 1915, right? So this company mapped all of their land holdings and all of the places where people were living. So we can zoom in again, right? And learn a little more about Chestnut Street and about Tamarack. It doesn't have quite as much information as Sanborn maps, but we can still get quite a lot of info. I'm going to switch us back though to the Sanborn maps, 1917. Okay. So now let's go back 2 years to school records. So these are the school records that Tim was telling us about. Let's start off seeing where she lived at home. Okay, and so that year, when she was 10, we see she was actually living with siblings, and her teenage brothers were looking after Angelina and her brother. And so let's zoom in and see where they're living. We can find out more about their family in a minute, about where they are, if you're wondering. But first off, we can see, zoom out one more, that they're living in this row of very small sort of tenement housing. And if you hit the story, there's actually, we know this was called Butler Row Tenements, and this is a user contributed story. So you could learn more about that. And if we close this, you can see, I mean, this was really dense this is a really dense block. 1918 was about the height of the population in this region. There were about 100,000 people living here. So any urban historians among us can surely look at that and think this is a really urban place, which in fact it really was. They were attracting a global population to this major growing industrial center. We can zoom out a little and get a sense of what it would have been like for Angelina living right here. There's a huge number of railroad tracks. This is part of the Mineral Range Railroad. This is their freight depot. This here is their passenger depot. So you can get a sense of the noise and the hubbub and the sort of industrial activity that is going on right around her. So if we head over though, so we see here, information about her ages again, information that we knew. We learn a little more though, since these are from school records, about her class. She was in the 5th grade in the A classroom, went to the Webster School, and we even have her teacher's name. So you could in fact learn more about Bertha Humphreys, click on her record and see where she was living. What we're gonna do is, well, I'll say, we can look at the related content, look at people, and if we followed her family, you would find out that actually the rest of her family was already living over on Chestnut Street where we saw them in 1920. And if we hit at the places, so we know where she's living, where her home is, but if we look at her school, right, so this is the address for the Webster School, and if we say show on map, bloop, there it was, there it is, right down here. So let's learn a little more about that school. Right, so if we zoom in, there's a wooden frame building at steam heat, right? No electrical lights, okay? And if we go back, go to people again, you noticed there was a whole list of classmates. So these are all the other 19 students who were in Bertha Humphreys' class that year. And go down here, we can also show them on the map. You really start to get a sense of how all of these children, where they were living. You could, of course, zoom in and find out more about each of their families, and you can really picture them walking, some of them over those giant railroad tracks to get to their school. I'm gonna go back to her school. Down here. Okay, and one thing we can do is see how that school space, how that school building changed through time. So if this was, if we move ahead, right, we find out that shortly after Angelina was a student there, a building actually went vacant. And if we want to know what happened to it, or more like what's going on there right now, if you change the base map to be the current satellite and use the transparency slider here, you actually see that where the Webster School is a vacant lot and has been for quite a long time. So I hope that gives you a taste of what the deep mapping experience can be like. You start with one person and go through connections with other people and places over time. And the more you do that, the more you can see relationships and patterns between these people and places that can lead you to questions that you might not have thought to ask otherwise. And that's really key to the deep mapping experience. And I'm going to stop my sharing and just note that that kind of developing of new questions is valuable to people in many, many fields, right, and can contribute to research into the built and social environmental impacts, social mobility, immigration, migration, settlement, many other things, labor and industrial history, environmental history, ethnic, racial, and religious identities. And we're really excited to see what people will do with it. So I'm going to turn this over to the podium and to Ryan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ryan Williams. I'm a geospatial research scientist here at Michigan Tech. I've been working with the project here on a lot of our data and mapping interfaces for the web. All of the maps and the data that you've heard everyone talking about so far are shared publicly. The maps have been published and shared via our geospatial research portal housed here at Michigan Tech. And the maps are served as tiled map services. These are powered by ArcGIS Enterprise, but they're freely usable and a whole variety of GIS desktop applications as well as web mapping applications. Many of them are out there that are proprietary or are open source and available to use for free. Our data is powered and managed by the PostGRE database management system, and we've also developed some custom APIs to allow us to share that as well. This data API was developed in conjunction with the programmers and the developers at Monte Consulting, in conjunction with the geospatial research programmers here in our facility. This API is developed using a freely usable web scripting software and the also freely usable PostGRE SQL database management system. These APIs, these map services, are what power the web application that you've seen Sarah demonstrating here just a minute ago. All the maps, all the data, and those interactions are available for others to use. These will all be freely accessible later in the year, and will be accompanied with further documentation and more training opportunities later in the year. And I'll introduce James Yipe to talk to us next.
All right. Hi, everybody. As Ryan said, my name's James, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about one of the key components of our Great Cat Explorer app, and that's the story component here. Sarah, when she was doing her great, the great walkthrough that you guys just saw, she hit on the Butler Row tenements, and we wouldn't know as much as we do about them if it wasn't for our great public historians and the people who share their knowledge with us. I think, as everybody here knows, practicing public history is important everywhere because the past and places are always contested. Here in the Keweenaw, some conflict has kind of arose over from the way that we have developed heritage tourism in the area over the last 30 years. The narratives that we have are typically dominated by our National Park Service and our own Industrial Heritage and Archaeology program here at Michigan Tech. Traditionally, we focus on mining history, and some of our community members feel that that's at the expense of other really important topics like agriculture in the area, the colonization of the Anishinaabe people, outdoor recreation, ethnic identity. The list goes on and on and on. Our story points allow community members to share stories, memories, all the things that matter to them, giving them a voice in this Copper Country heritage narrative. And it also gives them a personal connection to the deep map that's been created here. Next, I'm going to pass the podium mic on here to Don, and he'll talk to you a little bit more.
Thanks, James. So I hope everyone got a good sense through Sarah's demo and the descriptions that the team has made about how the deep map was created. I just want to do a quick overview of some of the accomplishments of the project to date. The project so far has produced 14 peer-reviewed publications. We've got 3 more in review. You can see those on the HESL Lab website. Many of you have seen us talk about this project over the years as it's developed, and we've been doing that through numerous conference papers as well as workshops on different components about deep mapping, spatial humanities, industrial history, and so forth. We've had 2 PhD dissertations, 2 MS theses, 3 undergraduate theses, and 4 more in progress. 48 university students and 65 high school students have been employed and trained in GIS, public history, the spatial humanities, historical geography. The project so far has inspired many spin-off projects in other communities around the world. I know many of you are here watching today. Thanks for joining us. And we've produced dozens of university class projects. The public outreach has been substantial. We've had about 1,500 one-on-one conversations with members of the public at festivals and public talks and workshops. Over 25 media stories and newspapers and TV and so forth. We've had about 300,005 or so citizen historian data classifications and transcriptions in that earlier phase of the project, where the public was going in and helping us fill in the data sets about the built and social environments. About 1,000 or so unique story points created thus far, and that's primarily in our first version of the app. We're hopeful that we see more of that coming with the new one. And about 45,000 unique users coming to the website over the last couple of years. And then the other major accomplishment, which you heard a lot about, is the data itself. And not just the data, but those spatial temporal links between the data that Dan was talking about, that really create the deep map experience that we're striving for. So far about 245,000 plus links across space and time, and those are growing. We have actively, as Dan was saying, adding more of those. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Hi, so what's coming next, right? We still have lots of work that we're going to continue doing. As I mentioned, we're still working on the 40,000 or so employee records, tracing the workers and employment and health and wages over time. We will continue making spatiotemporal deep map links across data sets. As Dan said, this is an iterative process. We'll continue refining the web app to improve a user interface and data discoverability with our colleagues at Monty Consulting. We'll also be finalizing open source data access through the web portal and APIs. And James is going to tell you about our educational plans.
All right. Well, we've got a number of really exciting events coming up with our community around us here. Through our existing collaborations, the project team will help implement guided activities and interactive lesson plans. We've already piloted a lot of this approach through several Park Services events with local teachers, including our Copper Traces program, the Quincy Mine the Quincy Educators Workshop in 2017, an NSF funded GIS-based local high school internship program that ran from 2016 through 2018. And one approach we're looking at piloting will pair community youth and elders together to foster intergenerational learning opportunities. A lot of our elders will provide that great historical context, while the youth will provide all the technical expertise. And research that we've been looking at really shows that pairing youth with their grandparents or grandparent-aged individuals in pursuit of civic engagement can afford a whole bunch of great social benefits for communities like ours. We're also looking at developing a webinar series. So we're going to entitle it Creating a Deep Map with Your Heritage Community, and it'll describe how to create an HSDI like ours, use a charrette model to gain public input and collaboration, and a technical webinar will cover the app development side of things as well as server needs. These are going to be advertised widely through our professional networks. They'll be openly available to anyone with a web connection via our Zoom account. And they'll also be simulcast live on our Facebook and YouTube channels. So if you haven't already, like us on Facebook and follow us on YouTube. Next, I'm going to bring Don up here and he'll talk about one more thing we're planning.
Yeah, so in addition to all the educational and heritage related programming, our next sort of big technological development in the project is to create a public mobile app. So you'll notice that if you try to use the app at home on a phone right now, it doesn't do that. That's the next phase. So we're going to be producing a GPS-based and geofence mobile app that gives you the experience of using the maps and data that are in the Keweenaw Time Traveler in the post-industrial landscape. Really thinking about this as turning landscapes into a mobile museum and giving people a new perspective as they walk through the landscape. And we're targeting this for a 2024 launch. So I want to, as we get to the end of the webinar here, I just want to say thank you to so many people. This has been a project that has taken a lot of people, a lot of creativity, a lot of interest. We want to thank the Geospatial Research Facility staff here at Michigan Tech, the HESO Lab associates, and there have been so many of them over the years that have made so many contributions to the project, and our public collaborators everywhere. We have many partners, some of our bigger partners, MTU Archives, Monty Consulting, IPLMS USA, and a number of our heritage partners at the Carnegie Museum and various historical societies. And of course, we need to thank our funders, that made this all possible. So thank you to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Council on Library and Information Resources, the Keweenaw National Historical Park Advisory Commission, the Portage Health Foundation, and Michigan Tech. So we now invite you to open up your browser, point your browser to mapyourhistory.org. You can explore the Keweenaw Time Traveler yourself. You can hopefully get lost in the maps and data, see what you can discover about the history, heritage, and geography of this region. We're now at that phase where we'll go to Q&A. And so we have some questions, and what we're gonna do for the Q&A is the whole team here that you saw on the webinar right here in front of me, and we're just gonna kind of rotate in and out and answer various questions for you as you know, based on what the question's about, I guess. And James is gonna facilitate the Q&A here by reading out the questions.
Right. So Don, our first real big question here is from Julia Nordegraff, and apart from letting us to join what sounds like a really amazing time machine initiative, and I'm sure we can talk with her in person later about that. She also asked a great question here. She says, perhaps I missed this, but how do you deal with privacy issues related to publishing such personal data?
Sure. Sarah, would you like to take that question?
Sure, I'll pop in here. We've dealt with that head on with the employee records because some of the records go into the 1930s and 40s, as I noted. That was probably a red flag for people. So we do use the standard 72-year rule. So any card that has information that's newer than 72 years will be embargoed, not shared online until that data is more than 72 years old. You know, those cards after the 1930s do actually include social security numbers, and those are never ever recorded. And those cards, you know, are not going to be able to be shared visually for that reason. So that's an instance of where we've taken on that issue sort of specifically related to that data set. You know, other than that, you know, we are inviting people to explore the data. If you know, people have questions about it, the website, which sort of goes along with the Explore app that I was demoing, has a lot of possibilities for talking to archivists, finding out more about the data sets. And also, I know there's a question, maybe we'll get to in a minute, about how conversations come about between people, right? And so that can help address some of those issues, right? If somebody has a different version of a historical narrative that they want to share, we invite them to share their own story and get into conversation with each other, right, in the Keweenaw Time Traveler. So that's how it, you know, can inspire some conversations between people. But you know, to address your original question about privacy, we adhere to 72-year rule for the employee records material. So I hope that helps.
All right.
What's
Sarah,
next,
we've got
James?
another question. This one's from James Levy. He says, there's time during the Q&A. Would it be possible for James or someone else to show us the interface for user input? I'm interested in what James has said about contested histories and plates, and I'm curious about how such contestation works on the interface. Coupled with that was a great question from Michelle Hamilton, who says, when the public tells you stories, is it a transcript or is it audio clips? And I think those two things kind of go together.
Yeah.
I wouldn't tell you what, why am I down here? I'll jump up here.
Come on in,
Sorry,
James.
reading a whole bunch of wonderful things that you guys are sending us right now. It's great to see all the excitement you guys have with this project. I really enjoy this side of things. What's wonderful about this side of the project is it gives people the opportunity to share. And I would encourage all of you right now, if you could, to go on to our app and check out the Share Our Stories link. You can click on the big button we have in the lower right-hand corner that says Share a Story, and you can see how this whole process works. The public's encouraged to pick the place that they see on the landscape where their story occurs. They can upload their own personal memories in the form of text. They can share, right now they're able to share any kind of pictures or images they want that couple with that story. And I think in the future, we're hoping to expand that to maybe audio or video files as well. For me, that's wonderful because it gives you an idea of what people really remember, value, and find interesting within the landscape. And when you look at all those stories together, you really start to create that that narrative that really comes from the public, where they can they really can share their own memories and experiences. And it's not just coming from historical data, and it's not just coming from, you know, historians like trained historians. It's coming from the public themselves, and that's a really wonderful and special thing. If you or anybody here in our app has any memories or stories or interesting things that they would love to share about the Keweenaw, I would encourage you to post them on our website. We'd love to hear from you. That stuff is, to me, really meaningful and valuable. Anything else, Don? Who's next?
So next question is from John Lutz.
Yeah.
He says, congratulations to the team. What an inspiring project. Have you considered 3D reconstructions of buildings? Do you think it'd be possible to write an API that would read the fire insurance plans for building types, heights, and dimensions?
Oh man, this is a Gary question, isn't it? Yeah. All right, I'm going to pass this over to Gary.
Yeah, so for 3D reconstructions of buildings, particularly using the digitized information from the Sanborn fire insurance plans, actually one of our time traveler alumni and colleagues, Dr. John Arnold, who is in the chat right now, did some work with this for his dissertation. And I've worked with that data as well. So Esri has this program. So this is the company that makes all of the sort of GIS infrastructure that we use outside of the open source materials. They have a standalone program called City Engine, which allows you to take polygons and will generate 3D models of the buildings and them using procedural modeling. So there is already a application available that does this. And I have worked with John's 3D models and buildings and things like virtual reality, exporting them through, it's an extension called Datasmith for Unreal Engine 4, which I'm actually really excited to play with some more as I continue my work myself. So yes, 3D models of buildings is entirely possible and supported, just not something that we can currently handle in the time travel interface, but it is something we have, yes.
All right, then I've got one here that I think Dan Trapal will probably want to answer. It's from Yves. Oh, yep, Yves Brennan. Please, she says, bravo, very impressive. Describe your sophisticated record linkage methods. Is the identification of surnames through time, does that remain an issue?
That's a great question, Eve. And it was something that it's inherent. Anyone who may have on here who may have done any kind of record linking work or work with historic census data will know that you know, the way that an individual is recorded in one historical record often does not match the way they're recorded in another record. So, and surnames are one of the things that we use as a very important category for linking, but it's also one that does change quite a bit. And you know, this is definitely something that breaks down on linguistic and ethnic lines. So, you know, so-called native or American Anglo-Europeans, their names tend to be a little more stable because the enumerators tended to also share that ethnicity. They understand a Smith or a Jefferson or something, they can write that down in the census pretty consistently. Coming from Slovenian heritage myself, the grandchild of immigrants, you know, one of the things I noticed when I was geocoding and record linking census data and other data was how Slavic names were consistently butchered in ways that made it very, very hard to link them sometimes. And that's when we have to rely on occupations and addresses and family members and any other information we can gather to try to develop those links. And you know, that's helped by the probabilistic record linkage software when you might be able to get a phonetic match or something like that. So Those are the ways we deal with it. It is a persistent problem, and sort of the further away you get from sort of an Indo-European or Romance language, probably the more difficult it becomes because of the way the census was connected, or these other data sets were collected, I should say, originally. And it's something that we're going to face probably forever as a major challenge of this sort of thing, but we're continually improving the ways that we deal with it. And the more records we actually link, the greater of a body of linked records we have, the easier it becomes to interpret these things in a way that gives us good linkages between people. So hopefully as time goes on, this develops its own inertia and its own momentum, and it gets easier and easier to find these people and connect them.
All right. Eve, I apologize for butchering your name. Well, my last name is spelled J-U-I-T and pronounced Yite, so it happens to me more often than not. Still, I'm sorry. Don, I got a question for you from John Clark. He says, could you speak with more detail about acquiring and using the IPMS data?
Oh, sure. So John, as you probably know, most of the IPMS data is available right on their website, ipmsusa.org, I believe. I hope I got that right, but that's pretty easy to find. But we've also benefited from being able to work pretty closely with Matt Nelson and some of the other staff there at IPMS to work through, working through the nuances of how to use that data in the way that we did. So I would encourage you to reach out to him, or maybe, I don't know if Matt's on here, but certainly reach out to the IPM staff. They're very helpful. They're there to help researchers just like us and all of us here to use their data as much as we can. So.
Great. Let's see. I've got something here from Trevor Harris. He says, great work. How are the discovered materials exported to enable narrative construction by users, and what formats are possible?
Okay, hi Trevor. Good question. We are still working on that part. So we have not yet, we're still in development of making the data download capabilities. That's what Ryan was talking about earlier. The APIs are basically ready, but we know that that's just for technical folks who know how to use an API. And so we'll be releasing the API and associated documentation a little later this summer. But we also are going to have a way for people to be able to download their spatial narrative in various formats. And so I'd love some feedback from you on ways that could look, should look. We have some ideas. We have a charrette planned in September to be working with some of our community members to get their feedback on what those should look like. But that's a forthcoming function that's not ready yet. But I'll send you an email and we'll chat some more about it.
All right. I think Sarah's finishing up answering in text a great question from Megan Cope. And apart from that, I think we've got most of our questions answered. I just wanted to mention to everybody here, Megan, you asked if we could enable closed captions. We worked on it. We weren't able to do it. But what we are hoping to do is make that available when we send out this recording to all of you and post it on our website. Gabriel, you asked if the PowerPoint will be available after the presentation. Absolutely. I think we can make that available to all of you who attended here. That would be an easy thing for us to be able to do. Apart from that, Don, if you want to wrap things up, yeah. I don't think we have anything else.
Well, thank you all very much for attending today and sticking through in early summer webinar online. We appreciate all your questions and feedback. Like James said, there's lots of information available on our website if you go, when you're in the app, if you just go to the top right hand menu there, you'll be able to get to some of those resources. Thank you all very much. I think we might have one more question just popped up.
Oh, Michelle says, hi, Don, amazing work. And John Arnold says, nice work all.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. We really appreciate you joining us today. And for any of those who are here in the Keweenaw, we hope to see you tomorrow night at the Carnegie Museum. Thanks, everybody.